The lanterns of Oakhaven. The violet flames consumed the church as Elias crawled through the bone-filled pit beneath it, his legs trapped in hardening wax. And in that moment of absolute despair, he understood. His grandfather hadn't fought the cult. He'd founded it. And now, as the burnt black shadows danced across the walls and the earth itself seemed to pull him deeper into its maw, Elias felt something ignite behind his ribs. A small, orange light that would never go out. 14 hours earlier, the day had been nothing but gray sky and pine trees. The narrow asphalt road cracked like an old face, weeds pushing through the fissures. Elias gripped the steering wheel of his silver 2015 Volvo SUV, knuckles white, eyes squinting through the tunnel of tall pine trees that leaned overhead like skeletal fingers. The vehicle crunched over gravel and dry needles scattered across the road. Low-hanging clouds blocked the sun entirely. This was Oakhaven's entrance, or so the faded wooden sign had promised 5 miles back. "Welcome to Oakhaven," it read. "Population 847. The sign had been vandalized long ago with a single word spray-painted underneath. No. Elias had driven 6 hours from the city to get here. His grandfather's house, his inheritance, and, according to the lawyer's letter, an opportunity to see the village's famous Lantern Festival, which was being held tonight. A local tradition, the letter said. Pre-autumnal harvest celebration. It sounded quaint. Forgettable. Exactly the kind of thing that might help him clear his head after the divorce. He pulled over in front of a sagging Victorian house with peeling white paint. The porch swing was broken, hanging by one rusted chain that creaked in the wind, though there was no wind. The chain swayed of its own accord. Elias sighed deeply and rubbed his face with his right palm. The engine clicked and hissed as it cooled, a familiar sound from the long drive. Through the windshield, he could see the massive oak front door. It was covered in bright red spray paint. Elias stepped out of the car. His boots sank into wet mud as he walked up the gravel path. The paint was fresh. The smell of chemical solvent still hung in the damp air. The words were crudely rendered in dripping letters, as if written in haste or fury or both. Blood remembers his jaw clenched, his brow furrowed. He took out his brass keychain and fumbled for the heavy skeleton key. The metal was cold despite the humidity. He inserted it into the lock and turned it. The sound was loud, iron clicking against iron, and the door groaned open on hinges that hadn't been oiled in years. "Welcome home, Elias," he muttered, bitter. The foyer was dark and silent. Dust motes danced in a single shaft of light coming from a high window. The air smelled of mothballs and time. And then he saw it. A dead crow lay on the floorboards. Its feathers were matted and black. Tied around its neck with a strip of rotting cloth was a small white paper lantern. Elias's stomach twisted. He moved closer. The lantern was stained with something dark, a single thumbprint of blood, crusted and old. He froze. His eyes were wide. His breath came shallow and quick. He stood there, staring at the dead bird with its paper lantern, unable to move, unable to look away. The village square was only a 10-minute walk from the house. Elias had driven there after leaving the crow where it lay. He couldn't bring himself to touch it. The shops were closed. The streets were empty except for clusters of villagers who moved in synchronized efficiency, hanging orange and yellow silk lanterns from black iron lampposts. They were so absorbed in their work that they didn't notice him at first. And then they did. All at once, every head turned. The hands stopped moving. The only sound was Elias's own footsteps on the cobblestones, clip, 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 like the ticking of a clock. He kept walking, chin up, shoulders back, trying to look undaunted. The silence was eerie. The lanterns they were hanging swayed gently, though still there was no wind. An old man approached from the crowd. He had a long white beard and a hooked nose that bent sharply to one side, as if it had been broken long ago and never healed properly. He wore a heavy wool coat despite the humidity, and he carried a wooden staff topped with a brass lantern. His shadow on the stones was unnaturally long, too long for the angle of the sun. His eyes were milky with cataracts, but they were sharp, and they fixed on Elias with the intensity of a predator recognizing prey. The old man leaned in close. Elias could smell damp earth on his breath, and old wax, the kind used in candles that had burned for decades. The man's breath rattled in his chest like wind through a tomb. "You have your grandfather's eyes, boy," the old man whispered. His voice was raspy, worn down by years. The eyes of a man who watched a village burn. Elias pulled back. The comment made no sense. His grandfather had been the sheriff here, according to the family stories. A good man, a keeper of order. Elias reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an old photograph. Black and white, edges slightly yellowed. In the photo, his grandfather stood in his sheriff's uniform, wearing his badge with pride, smiling at the camera. He was handsome in a severe sort of way, with the same sharp cheekbones that Elias had inherited. The old man moved with startling speed for someone so ancient. His gnarled hand shot out and snatched the photo. He crumpled it violently, the paper crinkling between his fingers. He leaned in even closer, his face almost touching Elias's face. "Look," the old man hissed. He held the back of the crumpled photo toward Elias. Written in thick black ink over his grandfather's name was a single word: Judas. Elias's mouth went dry. The villagers around the square had stopped pretending to work. They watched in complete silence. "The lanterns don't light the way for the living," the old man said, his voice dropping to a tone that seemed to come from somewhere deep underground. "They find the sins the dead tried to bury. Run, bastard, before the wick is lit." He dropped the ruined photo. It fell to the ground, landing in a puddle of water. Elias watched it sink, the edges curling as the moisture seeped in. He turned and walked toward his car. He didn't run. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. But as he walked, he felt their eyes on him, like weight. He made it back to the house and locked the doors. All of them. The front door, the back door, the side entrance that led to the kitchen garden. He didn't turn on the lights. He sat in the darkness on an old velvet chair in the parlor, watching the street through the front window. The sky was darkening. It was only 5 in the afternoon, but the clouds had gotten heavier, swallowing the light. At 6 o'clock, he heard movement outside. He moved to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains. 2 men in burlap masks stood in the street. They were tall and broad across the shoulders, wearing rough canvas clothes that looked homemade. They didn't move toward the house. They just stood there, watching it, waiting. Elias considered calling the police. The thought lasted only seconds. These people were the police, weren't they? In a village this small, the cult, if that's what this was, would run everything. The law? The church, the infrastructure of daily life would be riddled with their presence. He decided to leave, to get back to the car and drive away from Oakhaven and never return. He would abandon the inheritance. Some things weren't worth the money. He waited until darkness had fully fallen, until the street lamps came on and the 2 men had moved away. Then he slipped out the back door and made his way through the overgrown garden toward the alley that led to his car. He almost made it. The alley behind the general store was narrow and cramped. Wooden crates of apples, old and rotting, filling the air with a sweet, rancid smell. were stacked haphazardly along both sides. The smell made his stomach turn as he hurried past them, keys already in his hand, reaching for the car that was parked just 30 feet away. Two men stepped out from behind the crates. They were wearing burlap masks, but these weren't the same men from the street. These were different, shorter but denser, packed with muscle under their canvas clothes. They didn't speak. They didn't make a sound. The first one simply swung a heavy wooden plank. Elias ducked. The wood whistled past his ear, close enough that he felt the air displaced by its passage, and crashed into the brick wall behind him with a sound like thunder. Splinters erupted from the impact. The second attacker tackled him from the side. They both hit the mud-covered ground hard. Elias felt cold, wet earth soak into his jacket and through to his shirt. The attacker was on top of him, reaching for his throat, and Elias drove his knee upward with all the force in his body. It connected with the man's stomach. The attacker's grip loosened for just a fraction of a second, and that was all Elias needed. He rolled away, scrambling to his feet. His hand found a discarded glass bottle lying in the mud. Without thinking, he smashed it against the wall. The glass shattered, leaving him holding a jagged neck with edges sharp enough to draw blood. He held it up toward the first attacker, who had recovered and was advancing again with the plank. The attacker hesitated. The second one emerged from the dust and mud, also hesitant. They had expected an easy mark, someone to beat into submission, not someone who would fight back. In the distance, a bell tolled. 1, 2, 3. The sound was deep and resonant, like the voice of something ancient. The attackers turned and retreated into the shadows, as if that bell had been a signal. They melted back behind the crates and vanished. Elias stood alone in the alley, his hand shaking so violently he could barely hold the bottle. He looked down at his palm. Red blood smeared against his white shirt cuff where the glass had cut into his skin. He dropped the bottle. It clattered on the cobblestones. He ran the rest of the way to his car. He drove north, away from the village center, taking roads that climbed into higher elevation. He passed the town limits sign, but something made him stop. He pulled over at a scenic overlook and got out. Below him, the village of Oakhaven spread across a valley like something from a nightmare. Hundreds of lanterns had been lit throughout the streets and squares. They glowed orange in the darkness, pulsing slightly, as if breathing. The effect was hypnotic, mesmerizing. From this distance, it was almost beautiful. He stood there for an hour, long enough for his hands to stop shaking, long enough for him to convince himself that he had overreacted, that small towns always had odd traditions, that the men in the masks were probably just locals trying to scare off some outsider who was digging into things he shouldn't be digging into. The thing was, Elias hadn't been digging into anything. He had just arrived. He had done nothing but walk into the square, hold up a photograph, and listen to an old man's ravings. He got back in the car and drove south, back toward Oakhaven. He didn't know why. Some part of him, the part that had driven 6 hours from the city in the first place, the part that wanted to understand his family history, the part that couldn't just accept a mystery and move on, that part of him compelled him to turn the car around and head back into the darkness. He was an idiot. He would figure that out later, if he lived long enough. The church was a massive stone structure with a steeple that rose up like an accusing finger. Elias drove past it twice before he made the decision to stop. By this time, it was 10 o'clock at night. The streets were empty. The orange lanterns had been taken down from most of the lampposts. The square had been prepared for the festival proper, which would begin tomorrow evening. He left his car 2 blocks away and approached the church on foot. The front doors were unlocked. He pushed them open and stepped inside. The interior was vast and cold, dimly lit by a few candles that burned at the front near the altar. The pews were empty. The stone walls seemed to absorb sound, making his footsteps on the floor sound distant and muffled, as if he were walking through someone else's dream. A man emerged from the shadows near the altar. He was tall, with silver hair and a face that had the serene beauty of a statue. Too perfect, too composed. He wore a clean white cassock. His hands were pale and long-fingered. When he saw Elias, he smiled. It was a warm smile, the kind a doctor might give a patient before delivering bad news. "You came back," the man said. His voice was like honey. "I wondered if you would." "Who are you?" Elias asked. His voice sounded strange in the empty church, flattened and small. "My name is Father Thomas," the man said. "I was expecting you, actually. Your grandfather. Such a complicated man. He tried very hard to keep his secrets." Father Thomas descended the altar steps and approached with a ceramic bowl of warm water in his hands. "Come," he said. "You're injured. Let me help." Something in Elias's gut told him to leave, to turn and walk out and not look back. But curiosity had always been his weakness. And so instead, he found himself sitting in a pew while Father Thomas knelt beside him and began cleaning the wound on his shoulder where the lantern had burned him all those hours ago in the alley. His hand was clearly visible. On his right hand was a distinctive birthmark, shaped like a dark star. "Do you see it?" Elias said, his fingers shaking as he pointed. "This man, with the camera. He documented—" Father Thomas set the bowl down. He raised his right hand slowly. In the candlelight, the distinctive star-shaped birthmark was clearly visible. It was the exact same mark as in the photograph, though now it bore the weight of 60 years. "I didn't just watch Elias," Father Thomas said, and his honey voice had turned to something else entirely. Something cold and proud and ancient. "I was the one who decided whose light should be snuffed out. I was the one who made the lists. I was the one who sorted the damned from the saved." He stood with fluid grace and walked toward the church doors. From his belt, he withdrew a heavy iron key. He inserted it into the lock at the front of the church and turned it. The sound was final and absolute. "You see," Father Thomas continued, his back still to Elias, "the lanterns aren't just for the festival. They're a beacon. They call to something. Something that's been hungry for 60 years. Something that feeds on blood that remembers." Outside, the sound began. A humming. Hundreds of voices, all pitched at frequencies that made Elias's teeth ache and his vision blur. The windows of the church were suddenly covered with lanterns. They pressed against the glass, pushing, trying to get in. The orange glow filled the entire interior, casting everything in hellish relief. Elias ran toward the back of the church, toward the altar, looking for another way out. But there was only the main entrance, and Father Thomas stood between him and freedom. The priest pulled a massive, ornate copper lantern from beneath the altar. It was covered in etched faces, hundreds of them, all twisted in expressions of agony and despair. He struck a match. The lantern flared with a sickly violet light that was wrong in every way. A color that shouldn't exist in nature. A color that made Elias's eyes water just to look at it. "The time has come," Father Thomas said. And now his voice was layered with other voices, as if 1,000 people were speaking through his mouth. "The lanterns remember, and now they hunger." Thomas lunged at him. The hot metal of the violet lantern was like a branding iron, like the very substance of damnation made physical. Elias grabbed the priest's wrists, straining to keep the heat away from his face. The metal seared his skin, and he felt it beginning to blister, felt the pain rising up his arms like fire. They struggled near the altar, the lantern swinging between them like the pendulum of a clock, measuring out the seconds until Elias's defeat. He was younger and stronger, but Thomas moved with an unnatural fluidity, as if his body obeyed laws different from those of ordinary men. The priest's face remained serene, smiling even as Elias headbutted him with a desperate surge of adrenaline. Thomas's nose exploded in a spray of blood, and he staggered back but didn't drop the lantern. Instead, he swung it like a mace. The hot metal caught Elias in the ribs, and he heard something crack, a sound like dry wood breaking. His breath came in gasps. He was hurt badly, possibly with a broken rib, but the adrenaline was still flooding through his system, carrying him forward. Elias grabbed a heavy brass candlestick from the altar and swung it with both hands. It connected with Thomas's temple, and the priest went down, hitting the stone floor hard. The violet lantern fell from his grip and rolled across the carpet, leaving a trail of purple fire in its wake. Elias didn't wait. He ran toward the back of the church, searching for a window, a door, anything. The flames were spreading now, igniting the red carpet, climbing the velvet curtains, creeping up the ancient wooden beams. Above him, in the bell tower, something was ringing the church bells. Not in the measured, methodical way that bells should be rung, but frantically, wildly, as if in the grip of madness. The flames formed a wall, solid violet fire that blocked his path completely. And it was then that the walls began to dissolve. The church didn't exist anymore. Instead, Elias was standing in the town square of 1964. He could see it clearly through the flames, as if watching through a window into the past. His grandfather stood in the center, not as a witness, but as the architect. He held a list in his hands, a long list of names written in red ink. He was handing the list to a younger elder, Silas, and Silas was pressing a bag of gold coins into his hands. Elias tried to turn away from the vision, but he couldn't. His body wouldn't obey him. He was pinned in place, forced to watch. His grandfather accepted the coins. He smiled. Not a smile of shame or reluctance, but genuine pleasure. The pleasure of a man who had just sold something precious and knew he had gotten a good price for it. Elias looked down at his own hands. In the violet light of the flames, his skin looked like it was turning to wax. The texture was changing, becoming smooth and waxy, beginning to drip. He watched in horror as his fingers started to melt, as his flesh began to pool around his feet like a sick mockery of humanity. He looked at the folder again. The names of the people who had been purged in 1964. Dozens of them. Hundreds. And there, highlighted in red ink, was a name he recognized. Maria Vance. His mother's maiden name, his mother's family. His grandfather hadn't saved the legacy. He had sold his own family to the cult to survive. The floorboards beneath him gave way. He fell through darkness and landed hard on a pile of rusted lanterns and bones. Human bones. Hundreds of them, piled in a charnel pit beneath the church like the leftovers from some ancient sacrifice. The breath was knocked out of him. He gasped and wheezed, his ribs screaming in agony where the lantern had struck him. When he looked up, the hole above him was surrounded by figures. Elder Silas and a dozen villagers, each holding a specialized black lantern with a mechanical handle. They began to tilt the lanterns in unison, pouring liquid fire down into the pit. Elias threw his arms over his head and ran to the far corner. The liquid fire didn't burn him. It was cooler than he had expected. But it hardened quickly, coating him in a gray, waxy shell. The pain was the pain of being buried alive, of being entombed, of being sealed away from the world above. He struggled against it, clawing at the wax, trying to dig his way out. But the more he struggled, the more it seemed to harden. He was embedded in the bone-filled pit, surrounded by the physical evidence of decades of sacrifices. The purple-black darkness pressed down on him. Above, the fire raged and burning debris fell into the pit around him. Beams from the church, burning silk from the altar decorations, candles that had somehow ignited. Elias forced himself to stop struggling. He reached through the muck and found his grandfather's old sheriff badge. It was tarnished and black, as if it had been deliberately corrupted. He used the pin on the back to scrape at the wax around his legs. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The repetitive motion began to work. His legs started to come free. But the church was collapsing. A massive beam fell directly onto the wax, cracking it. For a moment, Elias thought it was salvation. Then he realized the beam had fallen directly onto his left leg, pinning it to the floor beneath tons of burning wood. He couldn't move. He was truly trapped now. Then he noticed something. A small, rusted ventilation grate near the floor. Air was flowing through it. Real air, not the superheated atmosphere of the burning church. If he could reach it, if he could enlarge it, he might be able to squeeze through. He stretched, straining every muscle, reaching with his fingertips. The grate was just barely in reach. His fingers brushed the cold iron. His nails scraped against the rust. A figure appeared above the grate. 2 boots. A wooden staff held by hands that had murdered hundreds. Elder Silas looked down at him through the opening. "Hello, boy," he said. Elias's survival kit. It seemed like a stupid thing to remember in that moment. But it might be the only thing that saved his life. He had always been a careful person, the kind of person who kept emergency supplies in his vehicle. A first aid kit, water, rope, and a flare gun. The flare gun was a bright orange plastic affair, the kind used by sailors and hikers in emergencies. It was buried in his jacket pocket, and his fingers found it. With movements that required every ounce of concentration he possessed, he pulled the gun free. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely load the red flare. But he managed. The chamber clicked shut. His finger found the trigger. He didn't aim at the grate. He didn't aim at Elder Silas. Instead, he aimed at the gas line he had spotted earlier, the copper pipe that ran along the basement ceiling, partially hidden by debris. It was the kind of detail he had learned to notice after years of urban exploration, of investigating abandoned buildings, of pushing his way into places where most people would never go. Gas lines, electrical conduits, the arteries and veins of buildings pumping either lifeblood or poison. The flare gun fired with a whoosh. The red flare streaked through the air like a comet and struck the copper pipe dead center. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the explosion was catastrophic. The force of it blew the ventilation grate open and collapsed an entire section of the wall, revealing the old coal chute that led up and out of the church basement. Dust and heat and the smell of ruptured gas flooded the pit. Elias didn't think. He simply moved. The beam pinning his leg had shifted in the explosion, and he wrenched himself free with a scream of pain. He hauled himself through the chute, climbing on hands and knees, pushing himself upward toward the opening he could see above. A small rectangle of night sky, stars visible through it like diamonds. He emerged behind the church, near the graveyard. The violet flames were raging out the front of the building, creating a skeleton of black wood silhouetted against the purple inferno. The villagers were distracted by the explosion. Some of them were trying to fight the fire with buckets of water that had no effect on the violet flames. Others had simply retreated, backing away from the heat. Elias ran. He didn't have a destination in mind beyond the silver Volvo parked at the edge of the square. His left leg was injured. He could feel it, even through the adrenaline, but it held his weight. He ran. His lungs burned. His ribs screamed with every breath. But he ran. He reached the car. He smashed the driver's side window with his elbow, ignoring the glass cuts that added new rivers of blood to the gore already covering his body. He reached through, unlocked the door from the inside, and threw himself into the driver's seat. The keys were still in his pocket. His hands shook violently as he inserted the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. For a moment, nothing happened. The car seemed to resist, as if it were reluctant to leave this place. Then the wheels caught the road, and Elias accelerated hard. He drove with no clear destination, just away. Away from Oakhaven. Away from the violet flames, and the lanterns, and the cultists, and the bone-filled pit beneath the church. He drove until the sky began to lighten at the edges, until the first hints of dawn touched the horizon. There was a scenic overlook on a ridge outside of town. Elias pulled over, unable to drive any further. He was running on fumes, emotional and physical both. His entire body was screaming in pain. His left leg was badly bruised, possibly fractured. His ribs were definitely broken. His shoulder was burned. He had cuts on his hands from the glass, from the fight, from the rough surface of the coal chute. He looked back at the village below him. Oakhaven was spread out in the valley, bathed in the blood-red light of the dawn. All the lanterns had gone out. The village was silent. A layer of fine white ash covered everything. The roofs, the streets, the square. It looked like snow. It looked like a grave. Elias reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his grandfather's black sheriff's badge. He looked at it with a disgust so profound, it felt like a physical thing. He held the badge up, feeling its weight in his palm, and then he threw it away. It arced through the air and disappeared into the deep valley below, lost in the mist. He sat on the hood of his dented car and tried to breathe normally. His hands were still shaking. He wondered if they would ever stop shaking. He wondered if he would ever feel normal again. He got back into the car and looked in the rearview mirror to wipe the soot and blood from his face. He needed to clean himself up before he got back to the city. The story he would tell would be a story about a car accident, maybe, or a hiking fall. Something mundane. Something that didn't involve cults and violet flames and bone pits beneath churches. He stopped wiping his face. He saw it in the mirror. A faint, orange glow emanating from somewhere deep within his throat as he breathed out a puff of white smoke. He pulled his shirt collar down. There, on his chest, directly over his heart, was a tiny, pulsing light. It glowed orange. It pulsed like a living thing, a heartbeat rhythm, slow and steady and absolutely impossible. Elias stared at it for a long time. He tried to touch it, but there was no wound. The light was underneath his skin, embedded in the muscle and flesh, pulsing with a rhythm that matched his own heartbeat. It was the exact shape of a flame. He put the car in gear and drove north, toward the city, toward the highway that would carry him back to the life he had come from. But as he drove, he passed under a stand of tall pine trees, and he looked down at his shadow on the road. His shadow didn't move with the car. It remained stationary on the asphalt, standing in the middle of the road, holding a lantern. 3 months later, Elias was living in a new apartment in a different part of the city. He had changed jobs. He had changed his phone number. He had tried to rebuild something that resembled a normal life. The burn on his shoulder had healed into a scar. The broken ribs had set themselves. The cuts had closed, but the light in his chest remained. It was small. He could hide it under his shirt. In the darkness of his apartment, he could almost pretend it wasn't there. But it was there. Every night, he felt it pulsing. Every morning, he woke to find his skin warm where the light burned beneath it. He had tried everything: ice, heat, doctors who had no explanation for the phenomenon. They had run tests and found nothing. There was no tumor, no infection, no logical explanation. They had chalked it up to some kind of psychological manifestation, a phantom sensation brought on by trauma. But he knew better. He had been there. He had felt the violet fire. He had walked through visions of his grandfather's sins. He had crawled through a charnel pit. He knew what was real. On the evening of the autumn equinox, exactly 3 months after his flight from Oakhaven, Elias received a package. It had no return address. It had been delivered to his apartment by courier. Inside the package was a white paper lantern, small and delicate, and a handwritten note on aged parchment. The note read, "See you next year." Elias sat alone in his apartment, holding the lantern, and listened to the radio. Music was playing, a haunting folk song, something that sounded old and from another place and time entirely. A song about lanterns and blood and the sins of fathers being visited upon sons. The song seemed to follow him. He heard it in coffee shops. He heard it on the street. He heard it in the elevator of his office building. He held the lantern up to the light. Inside, barely visible, was a small flame. Not a real flame. Something else. Something that glowed from within the paper itself. He didn't know what was happening to him. He didn't know if he had survived Oakhaven or if he was still there, still trapped in that bone-filled pit. And all of this was some kind of elaborate dream his mind had constructed while he died. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever had happened to his grandfather, whatever curse or blessing or damnation had been placed upon him in 1964, it wasn't finished. It had been passed down through the bloodline, waiting for him. And now it was inside him, pulsing in his chest like a second heart. He set the lantern on his nightstand. In the darkness of his bedroom, it cast strange shadows on the walls, shadows that looked almost like people, shadows that looked almost like they were dancing to music only they could hear. Outside his window, the city lights glowed. Somewhere in the darkness, autumn was turning toward winter, and somewhere else, in a valley surrounded by tall pine trees, in a village that nobody ever seemed to visit or leave, the lanterns were beginning to glow again, waiting, always waiting. Elias closed his eyes, and he listened to the humming that had never truly stopped since that terrible night. The humming of 1,000 voices, calling to him across the distance, singing a song that had no words, but somehow conveyed a meaning as clear as speech. "See you next year, Elias. Come back to us. The lanterns remember. The lanterns never forget. The lanterns hunger. Come back."